All right, well, good morning. It looks like it's 9:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Heather Raitt, the Program Manager for the Integrated Energy Policy Report, or IEPR for short. Welcome to today's workshop on hydrogen and fuel cell electric vehicle market status. This workshop is part of the 2020 IEPR update proceeding. So I'll quickly go over some housekeeping items. Today's workshop is being held remotely, consistent with Executive Orders N2520 and N2920, and the recommendations of the California Department of Public Health to encourage physical distancing to slow the spread of COVID-19. Instructions for attending or participating in the meeting were provided in the notice and include both internet and call-in options. The notice is available on the Energy Commission's webpage. This meeting is being recorded. We'll post a recording and written transcript on our website. Also, today's presentations have been posted on our website. We're holding this workshop in 2 sessions today. This morning, we have a presentation to provide a market overview of hydrogen and the fuel cell market, followed by a panel discussion of hydrogen supply and fueling infrastructure. We'll break about noon and come back at 1:30 for session 2, which is the panel discussions on heavy duty and light duty fuel cell electric vehicles. And just to let people know, we just posted a slightly revised meeting schedule for this afternoon, just a correction to the moderator names. Please note there will be a separate login for this afternoon session. We're working on making the IEPR workshops more engaging in this remote environment, and we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom with the capability to vote on questions posed by others. So attendees, you may type questions for panelists by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Before typing a question, please go ahead and check and see if someone else has already posed a similar question. If so, you can just click the thumbs up to vote on it, and that will move it up in the queue. And the questions with the most thumbs up or clicks are upvoted to the top of the list. So we'll do our best to respond to questions, but are unlikely to elevate all due to time restrictions. So now I'll go over how to provide comments for the material on today's workshop. There'll be an opportunity for public comments at the end of both sessions today. In Zoom, you can click the raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen to let us know you'd like to make a comment, and you can click it again if you change your mind and want to put your hand down. For those for those on the phone not using Zoom, press *9 to raise your hand, and we'll open your line during the public comment period. Alternately, written comments after the workshop are welcome, and they are due on July 23rd. Again, the meeting notice provides all the detailed instructions for providing written comments. And with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Monahan for opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather, and good morning, everybody. I've said this at previous workshops, but I want to reiterate that hydrogen fuel cells are the other electric vehicle. I think we have de facto been assuming that when we talk about electric vehicles, we're only talking about battery electric vehicles. And I just want to emphasize that really this is, hydrogen fuel cells are another form of electric vehicle. And California, I think, has really been leading the way globally towards commercialization of fuel cell vehicles and hydrogen infrastructure, as well as setting a course for reducing the carbon intensity of hydrogen. So there have been a lot of very interesting announcements in recent times about more investment in fuel cell, in hydrogen in particular. And this panel is really going to be discussing, where we are in terms of developing hydrogen and building out the infrastructure. One of the issues I've been particularly interested in is how do we seed the California leadership to other parts of the globe? I mean, the way we are going to be able to commercialize fuel cells and hydrogen is by global investment. And California has been a leader on this for a long time. For a long time, we were the leaders on battery electric vehicles too. And then we saw global investment, others following California's lead. That really built scale, drove down prices, and helped to lead to a pathway to commercialization. And that is the same trajectory that we want to encourage in the hydrogen and fuel cell world. So excited for this day of workshops on hydrogen and fuel cells, and looking forward to hearing what the panelists have to say and learning. So I turn to other members of the dais. I think right now we just have Commissioner Douglas on the dais. Commissioner Douglas, would you like to make any comments?
You know, just very briefly, I've been watching the hydrogen vehicle and infrastructure development over many years, as well as, of course, battery electric vehicles. And I'm really interested to learn more about where things are today and where we really reasonably can see this going. So very interested in this topic and look forward to the workshop.
We also have a representative from Commissioner Scott's office. Reza, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. First of all, thank you both for allowing me to join you on the virtual dais this morning. For those of you who don't know, my name is Retta Di Mesa. I'm an advisor to Vice Chair Janaea Scott. Today's topic is of importance to the Vice Chair, and she was really hoping to be able to be here today. Unfortunately, we weren't able to make it work with her calendar, so she asked that I pass along her apologies. For those of you who don't know, Vice Chair Scott is lead commissioner overseeing R&D efforts here at the Commission, and prior to that, she was lead commissioner on transportation. So our office is very familiar with the opportunities and challenges of the hydrogen market, particularly here in California. We know that to meet our energy goals, including getting to 100% zero carbon resources, we're going to need a mix of fuels and technologies, and we very much think that hydrogen is going to be a part of that. Hydrogen is an interesting energy source in that it has the potential to cut across multiple sectors, including both transportation and electricity, while providing multiple benefits. So it can play a role in not only decarbonizing transportation, which we're going to talk about today, but also integrating renewable resources, providing energy storage, and adding resilience to the grid. We recognize that there's a lot of work to be done in the hydrogen space. But we see a lot of opportunity for innovation to help drive the market forward. So some of the things that we're kind of looking at in the R&D division, research opportunities that can reduce the cost of renewable hydrogen production, supporting the development and demonstration of expanded use of fuel cells in mobile applications that are harder to electrify, like locomotives and hovercraft. We're looking at technologies for hydrogen in building decarb, and also the role of hydrogen in long-term storage. So we certainly recognize that hydrogen can serve as an important pathway in helping us get to a clean energy future. And I'm just really interested in looking forward to hearing the conversation today, listening and learning. So thank you.
Heather, are there any other members of the dais, or can we move on?
I don't see any others available right now, so I think we can go ahead and move on.
Great. Well, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Xiaoting Wang from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who's going to provide an overview of the hydrogen and fuel cell market to kick off the day's workshops.
Thank you for the introduction, Commissioner Monahan. Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to have the opportunity of sharing the research findings from Bloomberg NEF with a great audience here. So the scope of my presentation today will cover the economics of different segments along the value chain for the emerging hydrogen industry. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, I would like to start with a very general context about the demand of hydrogen. So in 2018, electricity made up 19% of final energy consumption, while the remaining 81% was consumed in the form of molecule-based fuels like coal, oil, gas, and biomass, or provided directly as heat. If the world continues along its present path, the global economy is to consume 54% more energy by mid-century as population and economies expand, with electricity taking a 25% share. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change offered a perspective of what it might take to achieve an emission trajectory that limits global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. The whole package includes 4 solutions: radical improvement of energy efficiency, or electricity from zero or low carbon sources, massive electrification that pushes up the share of electricity in total energy consumption to 53%. And finally, the other 47% energy consumed in form of molecule-based fuel would need to have very low emissions intensity. So this is effectively the potential market for a clean molecule like hydrogen, for bioenergy, and for continued use of fossil fuel with CCS. Next slide, please. So today, some countries have policies to encourage adoption of hydrogen in road transport, while there is a wider spectrum of potential application for the molecule. Manufacturing, power, and the supply of building heat could be significant sources of demand for hydrogen as well. Next one. In 2018, about 120 million metric tons of hydrogen was produced, with 41% generated as a byproduct from various industries. For the remaining 69 million tons made deliberately, most came from gas, coal, oil-based reaction, and only 4% was yielded through water electrolysis, which does not release carbon dioxide in the final process, but does utilize electricity from the grid, which generally make it even more carbon intensive. So in terms of consumption, almost all hydrogen is used as feedstock in the manufacturing of chemicals and basic materials. And hydrogen produced via water electrolysis has mostly supplied small and distributed applications, such as food and glass processing, polysilicon purification, etc. And the use of electrolysis in this application actually is not generally motivated by reducing carbon emission, but because electrolyzers provide better economics when the required hydrogen purity is relatively high, the volume is small, and the demand site is far away from the centralized production factory. Next one. So with this context, it's not surprising to see a very small shipment volume of electrolyzers nowadays. And China is so far the biggest market, where that manufacturing industry in general is still rising. In China, the more commercially mature alkaline electrolyzer is a single dominant product type. Next. The production cost of gray hydrogen depends on the spot price of fossil fuels. And here we define the benchmark as $1 to $1.8 per kilogram for countries with access to relatively cheap gas or coal. The cost of making green hydrogen varies for different electrolyzer technologies and power prices. Here we only consider alkaline and proton exchange membrane or PEM electrolyzer that are commercially ready. So for the 2019 benchmark, we assume electrolyzers are to source electricity from wind power plants. In general, green hydrogen production cost is 2 to 5 times that of gray hydrogen nowadays. But as the market scale goes up, we expect electrolysis-based green hydrogen production to achieve costs comparable with gray hydrogen in 10 years. And the former is likely to be 20 to 45% cheaper by 2050. Next one. So that prediction is based on our forecast of electrolyzer price and also LCOE of renewable electricity. Both will experience significant reduction in the following decades. Next one. During the past 5 years, the most mature two electrolyzer technologies, alkaline and PEM, had realized 40 to 50% cut at system capex, based on data reported in Europe and North America. Next slide, please. And a more dramatic contrast occurs between alkaline projects installed in China and in Western countries. The number in China provides a better benchmark in terms of what is achievable, and we build forecasts for electrolyzer cost after scaling based on this value. Next one, please. So PEM is less mature compared with alkaline electrolyzer, but it holds great potential in cost reduction, as suggested by the 20% learning rate observed in PEM fuel cells, which are based on similar product structure and working principle as PEM electrolyzer, except that their chemical reactions are of the opposite direction. Next one. So by 2030, we expect regional CapEx to converge, just as demonstrated by the history of PV industry. And alkali electrolyzer CapEx will fall by 30 to 40%, even compared with the value observed today in China. And another 30% cut is likely by 2050. PEM will be still more expensive than alkaline electrolyzer by 2030, and it will be more suitable for small-scale applications with the advantage of more compact physical design. But it is likely to achieve costs comparable with alkaline by 2050. Next. So the other side of the story is that renewable electricity is also becoming more affordable. We expect the LCOE of both PV and wind will fall to $30 per megawatt hour by 2030 in regions with relatively decent natural resource, and to further drop to $20 per megawatt hour by 2050. Next one. Note these values do not include the impact of emerging hydrogen industry to the market size of PV or wind, and they are for grid-connected utility projects. The electricity cost will be even lower if we revise the two assumptions. So first, by applying the PV and wind LCOE learning rates, which are 22% and 15% respectively, to the potential market boost introduced by hydrogen demand, we can derive the LCOE reduction. Next one. So the additional demand for PV can be 200 gigawatt or 2 terawatt by 2050 for the conservative and optimistic hydrogen market scenarios, which will result in 1 or 8% PV LCOE reduction compared with the scenario without demand of green hydrogen. Next one. And the potential cut on wind LCOE is 2 or 12%. Next one. Another assumption change for green hydrogen production cost is that instead of sourcing power from a remote PV or wind project, an electrolyzer can get electricity from a captive PV or wind power plant, which can save spending on long-distance cable, transformer, and grid connection fees. And more specifically, the electricity generated by PV and the power directly consumed by an electrolyzer are both of DC type. So for a captive PV plant for electrolyzer, or the DC to AC or AC to DC conversion components can be removed. So here I show a similar story for PV coupled with battery, which also directly charge or discharge DC electricity. Next one. So in a DC coupled solution for PV plus storage, some hardware can be removed and the overall conversion efficiency is higher. Next one. Overall, the power price of electrolyzers can be lower than our LCOE forecast for standalone PV or wind systems. So by 2030, the values will be in the range of $24 to $28 per megawatt hour. And for 2050, power cost will further drop to $15 to $17 per megawatt hour. Next one. So the production sector ends with the conclusion that the green hydrogen could cost less than $1.5 per kilogram by 2030 and $0.8 per kilogram by 2050. Next one. So the next story on the supply side is storage. Among many options, including compressing, liquefying, and combining with other molecules, the most popular method being used today is pressurized container, which is good for small volume and short duration. Next one. But if hydrogen can come to an influential scale and replace natural gas at most roles it is playing today, the required storage volume will be comparable for the two types of gases. So the average storage for natural gas in major market is about 10% of annual demand. Next one. For large volume and long duration, salt cavern is the best option, but salt deposits are necessary for the setup. Not many countries have the preferred geological condition, especially those in China, while US is lucky on that. Next one. So the next best option is rock carbon, although it costs about 3 times more than salt carbon. Next one. But the good thing is that if the scale goes up, the storage in rock carbon in the future can achieve the same cost as the salt carbon for today. Next one. So the last section of the supply side is hydrogen transport. The most often observed approach today is by trucks for small volume and short distance. When the volume comes to the level of several tens of tons per day, developing pipeline can be justified, and it will offer the lowest cost until the distance increases to 5,000 kilometers, beyond which ships are probably cheaper. Next one. So similar to the previous two sectors, there is great potential for further cost reduction for storage, although the magnitude is different for various options. Next one. So depending on the assumptions, the final price of green hydrogen can fall to $2 to $3 per kilogram by 2030, and $1 to $2 by 2050. Of course, much higher prices are likely if the conditions are far away from the assumptions we used here, including monthly storage in salt or rock caverns and 100 kilometers of transport via distribution pipeline. Next one. Fuel cell vehicles garner a lot of attention today, thanks to the initiatives of several large vehicle manufacturers, incentives from low carbon fuel standards, and some other government subsidies. There are much fewer projects, however, that demonstrate the use of hydrogen in other downstream applications, like steel production or shipping. Most of these sectors feature a small project pipeline with only 10 or fewer sites proposed, and weak economics for hydrogen relative to traditional fuels is one reason for the low number of projects. And another challenge is technical immaturity. So the equipment to use hydrogen in some sectors has a low technical readiness level, indicating it is further away from the commercialization. Next one. Despite the technical unreadiness at this moment, there is no fundamental hurdle that prohibits successful development of commercial products in the future that will allow the adoption of hydrogen for multiple applications. So we conducted a series of bottom-up sector-by-sector analysis to evaluate the economics of using hydrogen in the future compared with the current solution. At a bulk delivered price of $1 per kilogram in 2050, which was mentioned as a conclusion for the supply session analysis, hydrogen could enable emission reduction across many of the hard-to-abate sectors at reasonably low carbon prices. So the chart here shows the greenhouse gas emissions at all sectors where hydrogen could be used for, and the carbon price that would be required for hydrogen at $1 per kilogram to compete with the cheapest fossil fuel in each use case. And for road transport application, here we assume the final price of hydrogen at the fueling station is $4 per kilogram, based on which no subsidies would be required to compete with fossil fuels. And in 2018, carbon dioxide emissions from all sectors where hydrogen could be used amounted to 12.3 gigatons, or 34% of global greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels and industry. So this analysis suggests that up to 7.4 gigatons, or 20% of emission in 2018, could be decarbonized with the use of hydrogen. Sorry, for a carbon price of less than $100 per ton for carbon dioxide. Next one. So theoretically, the long-term demand of hydrogen can be as high as 1.4 billion metric tons, which is 20 times of the deliberate production of hydrogen in 2018. Considering that not all potential uses will fully replace existing solution with hydrogen from the economics consideration, we applied different penetration levels in each sector and expect about 700 million tons of annual hydrogen demand in 2050, assuming a strong policy support globally. And this would account for 24% of the global final energy consumption in 2050 in a global warming of 1.5 degree scenario that is described at the beginning of this presentation. And in this case, transport sectors would consume 43% of all hydrogen. So this is my last slide for today, and we will have some time for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. That was really interesting and exciting. I'm wondering, California has a target of a carbon neutral economy by 2045. And, so the presumption is that, we're going to zero, at least from an economy-wide perspective. And am I correct that the analysis that you've shown today isn't based on how do we reach deep emission reductions by 2050, but sort of what are the economics of hydrogen, separate from that long-term decarbonization target? Is that correct?
Yeah, so those comprehensive charts are based on the assumption that the 1.5 degree temperature control can be realized, and also to present a more neutral position analysis. For every sector, we provide a conservative and optimistic scenario analysis. So the optimistic is based on assumptions that every country or most of the influential countries will set up a strategy or policy to lower the carbon emission. Yeah, but definitely we admit that the tempo or timing for each country will be quite different.
Well, and I was also curious about the slides that you showed about the different ways you can make hydrogen more efficiently. And one of the critiques of hydrogen vis-a-vis batteries is that it takes about 3 times more energy from an electricity standpoint to electrolyze than it does to just use grid power for batteries. And I'm wondering, with the charts that you show, are there ways that the production of hydrogen, the efficiency could be increased so that that 3 times number could get reduced?
Yeah, sorry for the confusion. So that chart actually is not about hydrogen production. It shows a similar story in terms that the DC to AC or AC to DC conversion components can be removed for both PV powered electrolyzer and PV plus storage. So because there is no commercial product to show the concept for the PV powered electrolyzer, I just cite an example in the PV plus storage design. So they follow the same principle. So in that design, we estimate the capex can be reduced by about 10 to 15%, and the energy conversion efficiency can be boosted by about 2%. So we can expect similar effect in PV powered electrolyzer system design.
And has Bloomberg New Energy Finance done any equilibrium models where you're evaluating, well, from our perspective, what does that deep decarbonization pathway look like, and what's the relative reliance that we should have on different fuels? What's the optimal place to put those fuels where we don't have a ready solution? I mean, you identified some of the sectors that are harder to decarbonize, but they're more expensive to decarbonize. I mean, transport is hard to decarbonize. I don't want to. That's definitely the case. But have you all done any analysis about sort of what's the optimal pathway for decarbonization across different fuels?
So we don't have a very comprehensive, single sentence conclusion on that. So what we have right now is to look into individual sectors and compare the relative economics, in terms of levelized cost, and see how more expensive hydrogen would be compared with the current or traditional solution based on fossil fuels. So with that, we know from the economic side, how far it is for, to convince a certain industry to adopt hydrogen. But in terms the optimum, I think that really depends on a lot of factors. For example, some industries have less priorities on the carbon reduction because it needs to secure international capability on competition. So for those sectors, it's more challenging to convince the industry to adopt green hydrogen or low carbon solutions.
Great. I'm curious, and then I'll turn it over to Commissioner Douglas. I don't want to take all the air in the room on the dais. So I've read about Japan investing in brown hydrogen in Australia, basically using coal to produce hydrogen, and then assuming that CCS is going to work. And it's those kind of projects that make me nervous, where I think, wow, that is really the pathway we want. And I mean, your analysis is quite bullish on we can make this zero carbon. In fact, we can do it pretty quickly. And yet some of the investment that's happening globally is, I think, less than optimal, shall we say, from a carbon perspective.
Actually, we did also conducted analysis about the CCS. And the quick conclusion is from the economic side. So it's called blue hydrogen. So we still use fossil fuel to generate hydrogen and coupled with CCS. So the blue hydrogen will introduce, the best case is 0.5 to $1.1 per kilogram actual cost on top of the production cost by 2030, and 0.1 to $0.3 per kilogram reduction could happen by 2050. Actually, a more fair comparison between the blue hydrogen and green hydrogen is green hydrogen coupled with storage, because one advantage of blue hydrogen is you can get a steady supply of hydrogen because you can control the feeding of fossil fuels. But even that, considering the storage cost is only about 0.1 to $0.2 per kilogram. So from the economic side, green hydrogen still wins over blue hydrogen based on CCS. But I guess that is a case-by-case study. If you have the perfect geological condition to store the carbon, and you can do it immediately, because that very low cost promised by green hydrogen is based on large scale, and it's not going to happen immediately. So I guess before the green hydrogen becomes super cheap, it still makes sense to use CCS if you have the right geological condition.
Yeah, to Sugar, we have not made CCS work anywhere. I mean, I hope it works. We need it. And yet there's been a lot of optimism around CCS. So when it really comes down to which projects have been successful, we don't have a track record.
Yeah, so far there are only 4 large-scale CCS projects in North America, including the US and Canada. And 3 of them are not for like low carbon applications. It's designed to capture carbon dioxide to use in the enhanced oil like recovery.
Commissioner Douglas, do you have some questions?
I just have one question. You know, it's not directly related to your presentation, actually, Dr. Wang. So, but my understanding is that there is an increased effort to export renewable hydrogen produced by offshore wind out of the UK, and Australia is moving, as I understand it, reasonably aggressively into exporting renewable hydrogen. And I was just curious if you could help me understand just the market dynamics around that. You know, what are the price points? What are the markets? Where is this going? Do you see this growing? Do you see this as something that California, with our abundant sunshine and other renewable resources, should be thinking more about?
So, okay, those projects are developed as a demo type, and it's very hard to define a clear timeline. Because when we look at all the announcements for renewable hydrogen production in total, more than 3 gigawatt project pipeline has been accumulated by the middle of 2019 already. And I know the pipeline is still going on. But if you look at them, most of them are at the early stage called feasibility study, especially for the huge ones at several hundred megawatts. But there is a clear reason why the electrolyzer should be coupled with offshore wind projects if you have that natural resource. It's because the capacity factor offered by offshore wind farms is much higher than other renewable projects, especially compared with PV. It matters because if we are designing an electrolyzer to be powered by the renewable projects, the levelized equipment cost will be much lower if the capacity factor of the power plant is higher, because that suggests a higher utilization rate of the electrolyzer facility. This is very important because at the moment, most of the electrolyzer offered with Western brands are very expensive.
Mm-hmm. So just as a quick follow-up question, one of the best, really the best region in California for offshore wind is a region that is very much cut off from the rest of the state's electricity grid. And so it's been a challenge to think about how offshore wind could scale up in kind of far northern California. But obviously, if you were doing an offshore wind project that included designed around an electrolyzer and with a fundamental purpose of producing hydrogen, you could use that resource, and I would imagine transport the hydrogen out of the region. I mean, could you help me understand, you know, what that might entail? You know, are you shipping the hydrogen? Are you know, what's is there a ready market for such a thing? Where is the technology close to there?
Yeah, I would say the final system image will be quite different depending on the final application. As you mentioned, if the offshore wind resource is far away from the central parts of a certain city, it's not an issue if the final application is heavy chemical production, for example, ammonium production. You can just build your electrolyzer close to the wind resource, and also you can build the ammonium production site close to the electrolyzer site. It's not a problem. But if the final application is, let's say, road transport, which means the final application will be very distributed. So that could be a problem. It's likely that although the electricity is cheaper, or the final LCOH or levelized cost of hydrogen could be cheaper if you put that facility close to the offshore. It still makes sense to use distributed PV as a power source, considering it can save the transport cost. So there is no like consensus about the system design at the moment. It really depends on the final application. So that's why we think like PV industry and wind industry is so easy compared with hydrogen, because hydrogen is about like a whole system. It's not only about the upstream, like for PV or wind, it's just the upstream from the electricity system. This is about like ore infrastructure for storage, transport, and also the final application.
That makes sense. Thank you. That's helpful.
Heather, do we have time for a few of the Q&As from the audience, or do we need to move on?
We could just take a question or two, I think. We have Jonathan Bobadilla from the Energy Commission is moderating the Q&A. If you could go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, we have a question from Sarah Kurtz. Dr. Wang, do you have a projection of the efficiencies of the hydrogen generation by PEM and alkaline electrolyzers? What round-trip efficiency do you expect for electricity to hydrogen to electricity?
Okay, so it really depends the definition of efficiency. And if we use high heating value as like the standards, the efficiency at the system level is about 75% for a megawatt scale electrolyzer. Of course, efficiency would be lower if we go to smaller scale projects. And the round trip efficiency, it depends what technology is being used at the final end. If we're using fuel cell, so the round trip efficiency would be around 40% at this moment. But if at the final end, we're going to use hydrogen gas turbine, by the way, that product is not commercially mature yet. Although the like the equipment manufacturer can make turbine that is compatible with 30% hydrogen plus 70% natural gas. So for the gas turbine solution, right now the round trip efficiency is about 30%.
All right, thank you, Doctor. And I'll recommend that the rest of the questions be saved for public comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang, and thank you, Jonathan. So now we will, this is Heather Raitt. We'll go ahead and move on to the panel discussion of hydrogen supply and fueling infrastructure. It is moderated by Jane Berner from the Energy Commission. And so Jane, if you could go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Heather. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Berner, a member of the Hydrogen Refueling Infrastructure Unit within the Fuels and Transportation Division of the California Energy Commission. I am part of the team that administers Clean Transportation Program funding that supports the building of hydrogen refueling infrastructure for fuel cell electric vehicles. In this role, I have been privileged to work with many of today's panelists, and it's my pleasure to moderate this morning's discussion on the status of hydrogen supply and refueling infrastructure. The panelists joining me in this discussion are Jacob Teeter from the International Energy Agency, Wayne Leedy from Shell, Shane Stevens from First Element Fuel, and Dave Edwards from Air Liquide, who will also be speaking about the Hydrogen Council. So first, let me explain a little bit about the format of this morning's panel. Each panelist has prepared a short presentation. So I will introduce each panelist one at a time, and they will each have a turn at the mic. After all the panelists have made their presentations, we will take questions and comments from the virtual dais, so from our commissioners and commissioners representatives. And then following that, I will guide the panel through some additional discussion, and we will close the panel by taking some questions from the audience. So without further ado, let's get started with our first panelist. And that is Jacob Teeter, who is an energy analyst at the International Energy Agency. He joined IEA as a transport energy modeler and policy analyst in 2015, and now leads the team of transport analysts in the Energy Technology and Policy Division. In this role, he aims to contribute to the global dialogue on policies to promote transport technologies and services that improve quality of life while minimizing pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental and natural resource impacts. So Jacob brings a unique perspective to us because he knows California. He earned his PhD in transportation technology and policy at the University of California, Davis. But he's also a man of the world. He can give us an international context. And today he's joining us live from Paris. So Jacob, thanks for spending your evening with us, and I will turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks a lot, Jane. So thank you everyone for the invitation to present and discuss these issues today. It is quite an honor and a kind of virtual homecoming to have the opportunity to discuss in this forum. I think actually the next speaker was a colleague of mine at UC Davis. So we're stacked a bit heavily. I learned quite a bit watching that presentation already from Dr. Xiaoting, and I am assisted in pulling together this presentation that I'll show quickly today by my colleague Jose Miguel Menendez Bermudez, who is the IEA's kind of point man on the role that hydrogen can play in the clean energy transition. And especially for questions focusing on production and storage, kind of supply side questions, I will have to resort to his help. And there may be a bit of pause in giving detailed answers because I focus more specifically on the transport side of things. So system level questions, I would be happy to do my best to answer, but I'll also be in contact with him. Next slide, please. So as national and regional policymakers are beginning to coalesce on the fact that hydrogen will be an essential part of the energy transition, and countries recognize that decarbonizing, especially the hard to abate sectors, will require a role for hydrogen, investments have also followed. What we see here is the growth of early stage investments in storage, hydrogen, and fuel cells, and that's in the light purple. These investments in startups with new technologies have grown, global seed A and B investments have grown even as investments in low carbon transport, shown here in the light blue, primarily in batteries, fell in 2019. Among the deals for hydrogen technologies, most were for firms with novel hydrogen production devices, such as pressurized or photocatalytic electrolyzers. Other indications of growing interest in the investment community in hydrogen come from higher levels of growth equity, despite lower follow-on deals that investors are making in storage and hydrogen in general. Venture capital has also flowed increasingly into hydrogen, as for instance, with Total's investment in Sunfire. Next slide, please. So the momentum has been diversifying quite a bit to the countries where policy support is the strongest. And in terms of deployment of fuel cell electric vehicles and hydrogen refueling stations, things have evolved rapidly even since 2018. So in 2017, when the US and basically California accounted for about half of the fuel cell electric vehicles on the road, the picture has evolved quite a bit. In Japan, the sales of FCEVs have continued to grow steadily, and Korea has gone from about 100 fuel cell cars on the road in 2017 to more than 5,000 in 2019. Sales in Germany, France, and the UK, as well as other European countries have risen as well. But I think the most interesting story is the rise of fuel cell vehicles in China. And this has occurred almost entirely since 2018. And what stands out there in China, in contrast to all the other market leaders in FCEVs, is the disproportionate focus on light-duty trucks and buses, that is, on commercial vehicles. Indeed, this strategy that China seems to be pursuing in first adopting fuel cells and hydrogen in these applications is very much in line with one of the niches where the IEA analysis finds hydrogen in road transport applications to make the most sense in terms of competitive total cost of ownership. When comparing the total cost of ownership across various road modes, various applications of road vehicles, it may come as no surprise that the best near-term value proposition seems to be in heavy-duty vehicles with high energy and power needs, operating on fixed, ideally hub and spoke routes, fueling at a single large hydrogen refueling station. Also, China, by going the route of commercial vehicles that operate intensely, has very quickly paid back the initial high capital costs that come with fuel cells at a time when learning hasn't yet resulted in rapid decreases of the cost of those fuel cells. China has also taken advantage of byproduct hydrogen coming from chemical industries like chlor-alkali production. So in short, China has found this niche where in road vehicle applications where hydrogen seems to make the most competitive sense. Next slide, please. So where do we find ourselves then in terms of what many countries are hoping is the initial stage in a ramp up of fuel cell electric vehicles that will mirror in many ways the rapid market adoption of battery and plug-in hybrids? In terms of vehicle stock, we went from just under 1,300 fuel cell electric vehicles on the road in 2018 to more than 25,000 in 2019, so almost a doubling. Sales more than doubled over those same 2 years, from a bit more than 5,700 in 2018 to over 12,000 in 2019. If we compare this, of course, to the 7.2 million electric cars, battery and plug-in electric cars on the road, and to the 2 million EV car sales in 2019, then the lag of a little less than a decade is quite evident. And this means that about actually less than 1% of zero emission vehicle sales globally were fuel cell electric vehicles in 2019. Next slide, please. But the countries backing the scale up of fuel cell electric vehicles have bold targets, starting with Japan, who target sales figures of 200,000 in 2025 and more than 800,000 in 2030. Korea, as shown here, 81,000 fuel cell electric vehicles targeted by 2022. Netherlands, France. Our estimates are that achieving these targets would mean that the FCEV stock of road vehicles in 2030 would be around 10 million vehicles. And this kind of speed of this scale up would indeed be something similar to what we've seen since around 2012 in electric vehicles, and replicating that for fuel cell electric cars over the coming decade. But I would argue that the challenge is even greater than what we saw and what for most was unexpected in terms of the scale up and adoption of electric vehicles. This because a parallel infrastructure is needed in the case of FCEVs, and because China isn't listed among these countries on this slide with government targets. There is, of course, a roadmap in China, just as there is in the California Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Partnership. Next slide, please. So, there are economies of scale that come from the fact that the two largest cost components of building a hydrogen station are the compressor and the storage tanks. But there are risks about scaling up hydrogen stations because there's an uncertainty about the utilization. And so there's a tension between scaling up the refueling station size and the certainty on the demand side. And of course, just as in the case of electrolyzers, by getting higher utilization, you can amortize the capital costs. So it is exactly this uncertainty that, just taking one piece of the overall systems level puzzle leads to a lot of the difficulty and complexity, even just within road transport, of analyzing the potential for hydrogen. Next slide, please. So we can see here global public RD&D investment totals that are indeed lower than they were in 2008, which was the peak of interest in hydrogen, but have started to grow. In contrast to the last time around, though, there seems to be a growing engagement in the potential ways in which hydrogen really will be needed to help reduce emissions, starting in heavy industry, steelmaking, chemicals, fertilizer production, refineries, and in transport, likely in road freight, but certainly also, I would argue, as a feedstock for making ammonia or even for synfuels for aviation. More concretely, governments are taking heart in the recent successes, as Xiaoting showed, in RD&D funding as catalyzing the tremendous cost reductions we've seen already in PV and wind and in lithium-ion batteries. Linking hydrogen production to these variable renewables, as was shown in the previous presentation, together with the cost reduction potential in electrolyzers, has the potential to make this production pathway competitive in various applications with incumbent and mostly fossil fuel based technologies. Similar economies of scale also have great prospect to bring down the costs of fuel cells. But in transport, the question of where hydrogen makes the most sense and where it will be indispensable, where it can complement batteries and where it can serve as a hedge to hurdles in further battery development, I think is still a question up for debate. And I hope that we can engage a bit on these questions as well today. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, Jacob. So we'll turn next to our next panelist. Wayne Leedy is the Business Development Manager for North America for Shell Hydrogen. Shell has received Clean Transportation Program funding for 8 hydrogen refueling stations in California. And I know I always like to hear Wayne speak because I think you'll see he has a deep technical knowledge about hydrogen, energy, and transportation, but he also has the business acumen to use that technical knowledge to evaluate opportunities and risks in the hydrogen market. And I guess this makes sense as Wayne has earned both an MBA and a PhD in transportation technology and policy from UC Davis. From my perspective, Wayne has been integral in getting the hydrogen community to focus on how to scale up the hydrogen market such that there is a strong business case for hydrogen as a solution for decarbonizing the transport and energy sectors and achieving the emissions reductions that we need. And I just like to personally say his involvement in our staff workshops has been of great value as we have discussed how to use our transportation funding dollars for hydrogen infrastructure as efficiently as possible. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Wayne.
Thank you, Jane. Very kind introduction. Can I just confirm you can hear and see me?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. So it's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm Wayne Leedy, as mentioned, Hydrogen Business Development Manager for Shell since 2017, and indeed continuing the theme of UC Davis alums. Did my graduate work there over a decade ago with Professors Joan Ogden and Dan Sperling and others. And my dissertation was on these transition paths to our emission reduction goals that we are now all working to achieve. So what a great privilege to be working along with you on those paths. I really look forward to our discussion, so we'll try to just offer some comments on topics that may be of interest. If you go 2 slides ahead, the next one is just our normal caveats. Thank you. We created our New Energies organization in Shell several years ago from the observation in our strategy and scenarios teams of the underpinnings of the energy transitions, changing fundamentals in the economics combined with the policy signals. And so Shell now, like you, is navigating and in and toward a multi-fuel future and decarbonized future. We're working across this full range of new fuels, which gives us perspective on how the alternatives compare and compete and in fact complement each other in transportation and energy systems. And it also creates some unique insight for us on the progress needed with each one to unlock the opportunity. I think the benefits of hydrogen in transportation are becoming well known and don't need to be belabored. It's fast refueling of a zero emission vehicle with a high energy density by mass and economies of scale that are unlocked. All the benefits of an electric drivetrain in the torque and the quiet and effortless experience without compromise in the refueling, the cost, the convenience, the capability of that vehicle, whether you're a private owner or a commercial fleet, and the freedom to move. So the salient question is how to realize that potential in a commercially viable offering, a compelling, better product in the vehicle performance and zero emissions that achieves cost parity or better. I think California policy calls for acceleration and scale, nothing short of tipping points in majority adoption of these zero emission vehicles. So a few observations, if I may. There are practical constraints. Customer choice is essential for this widespread adoption, and wires and pipes are needed in California energy systems. An orderly transition is key to avoid imposing deadweight loss on Californians. The transition path matters. The area under the curve of emissions mitigates climate change and improves human health. Success really requires new entrants in vehicle makes and models and expanding infrastructure. And at the end of the day, customers choose. So focus on customer segments and value propositions more than vehicle classes and use cases. So I think our focus is the same: customer value proposition for the adoption of these vehicles and the business case for investments in California. Next slide. I think it's important to recognize that hydrogen is a flexible molecular energy carrier. So let's expand our viewpoint to sector coupling. It is essential for the reliable, resilient, and affordable energy system in California. It is essential for this hard to abate sector in transportation, where the LCFS trades at about 10 times the cap and trade. But there are also other hard to abate sectors where this molecule will serve well. And the diversity of these pathways for how to make hydrogen is a strength for making use of in-state resources and solving environmental challenges with closed loops. These are the win-win opportunities for environmental improvement and economic development in California. So I think California policy has the right approach: focus on carbon intensity and renewable content for zero emissions while leaving open what pathways are used. This is an important area clearly for continued policy work to activate and enable scale, to couple sectors, to harmonize across policies. It's not easy, neither is what we're doing on the industry side, so we're happy to work with you. And I would say the opportunity is bigger than achieving the emission reduction goals, already a tremendous challenge. It's also about infrastructure stimulus, reliable and affordable energy systems, and continuation of the California energy industry. The ARB's analysis of self-sufficiency shows about 6% public funding leveraging 94% private sector investment. Next slide. I just want to touch on the pace of progress in hydrogen. This is our next refueling station. It's large, it's rapid. The number of vehicles in quantity and diversity is growing. The station infrastructure is starting to move from single stations to programs. In Germany, a new station opens every 2 weeks or so. Here in California, the cost of refueling stations has nearly halved while doubling in capacity about every 3 years. One more halving and doubling would put hydrogen station on cost parity with gasoline. Hydrogen is now priced in California at parity with fast charging while offering about 10 times the level of service in the rate of charge. Shell is selling today in California 100% renewable hydrogen. The public funding for ZEV infrastructure has been approximately equal across the zero emission vehicles on a per vehicle basis. And I think this will be decreasing in hydrogen. Pay attention to the GFO 19602 applications when they become public. And we're developing heavy duty refueling stations for drayage trucks in the ports of LA and Long Beach. Last slide to close then. Your policy signals are so very important. California is investable because the policy is stable. Otherwise, it's often a very difficult place to do business. So please don't lose that. At Shell, our business planning is underway for this year, and the signals like the multi-year approach to funding, the HRI pathway and low carbon fuel standard, the ACT and ICT regulations, they work, they influence our thinking and our business planning. We are asking hydrogen to be cost competitive with gasoline and diesel at a very small scale, something like 1/1000th the scale of gasoline, and longevity, something like 1/100th, and yet we start to see that it's possible. That's it from me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Wayne. So next, we're going to turn to Shane Stevens. He is one of the founders of First Element Fuel and serves as the company's Chief Development Officer. First Element Fuel operates the world's largest network of retail hydrogen stations under its True Zero brand, and Shane oversees the company's station development program, business development efforts, and government relations activities. Shane has a PhD in engineering from UC Irvine and previously worked at UC Irvine's Advanced Power and Energy program. So for my count, First Element has been awarded Clean Transportation Program funding for 31 stations, 20 of which are open today. And I think it's hard to overestimate the importance of the contribution that Shane and First Element Fuel have made to the development of hydrogen refueling stations in California. Their work has enabled automakers to release fuel cell electric vehicles in California and allowed Californians to experience the fuel cell technology. And for what I've seen, and all of Shane's responsibilities. He's always moving from one meeting to the next, so I always find it strange to see him sitting in one place for a few hours. So I want to say thank you, Shane, for joining us and for these next hours and for sharing your perspective. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Jane. And let me also just do a confirmation that folks can see and hear me okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your kind words, but let me say that I and the team at First Element are so grateful for the opportunities that California has given us. Our company would not exist if it weren't for the visionary policies that have been implemented at the state. Everything from the ZEV program to the LCFS program, and of course for our little company, most importantly, the CEC's Clean Transportation Funding Program has been, the enabler for what we've accomplished so far. And I will also say that we've just had a fantastic experience working with previously Commissioner Scott and now with Commissioner Monahan and with the staff. The staff of the hydrogen program is just outstanding. So thanks very much. If we can go forward to the next slide, please. What I wanted to do today was just briefly touch on some of what we've accomplished so far, and then just quickly go through a few lessons learned that I think address some of the topics that this panel is trying to achieve, get to. So first, what First Element Fuel has done, Jane stole my thunder a little bit. So we have put CEC grant dollars to work. We've built what is today, from our count, the most heavily used network of hydrogen refueling stations in the world. We have 20 stations open with 19 more in various stages of development. And our network also, from our count, has the highest availability in the world. That means that we have a better uptime record and more hours open, a lot of 24/7 open stations, making it the most accessible and available network of hydrogen stations in the world. We've completed over 550,000 fills. We've replaced over 113 million gasoline miles with zero emission vehicle miles of fuel cell cars. And we've avoided over 71 million pounds of CO2. These statistics are important to us because part of our mission statement is to address the economics of driving, but also to reduce the impacts of driving on the environment. So for the layperson, 71 million pounds of CO2 avoided, that's the equivalent of planting a forest about 3/4 the size of the city of San Francisco. So, that feels good that we're at an early stage of this and already being able to make that kind of accomplishment. We've raised over $90 million in private financing. And so that actually now greatly exceeds the amount of public investment that's been put into us primarily by the California Energy Commission. So that's exciting for us because, I'm a believer and our company's a believer that for clean energy solutions to be successful, they do have to make business and economic sense. And we've created hundreds of California jobs in the process. Looking more broadly at the CEC's hydrogen refueling infrastructure program, the program has enabled the launch of fuel cell electric vehicles in California. As Jane said, customers can now drive these cars seamlessly throughout the state. A customer buying a fuel cell car in San Diego on day one can drive to Lake Tahoe to go skiing on the network with just swiping a credit card and doing 4-minute fills along the way. Private sector companies are learning how to achieve scale. Wayne alluded to this. I think this is very exciting to achieve scale in the performance of hydrogen stations. And what this is doing is now driving interest from other sectors like transit, commercial, and heavy duty. So, you know, thanks to the success and the learnings of what we're seeing in the light duty market, other sectors are starting to embrace, yes, hydrogen is getting ready for prime time, and the scale is getting there to where we can deploy these other vehicles. Market initiation in this sector has unlocked larger private investments. So I talked about just the private investment for First Element, but many more private investments beyond that taking place as well. And the key policies that we have in California are achieving greater renewable content, driving aggressive carbon reduction in this sector. Next slide, please. So first learning I'll briefly talk about, getting to scale and higher capacity is critical to success. So on the top portion of this slide, you see several of First Element stations that we deployed in the first generation. And we early on learned that these stations were going to struggle to keep pace with the demand when the automobile started hitting the road. So you see 3 stations here with lines of cars waiting to refuel. This is not an encouraging customer experience, right, for people that want to get into a fuel cell car or for the automakers that are trying to bring the car to market. You know, I show 3 stations here. We actually have about 10 to 12 stations, I would say, that experience lines on a regular basis. So if you're the 4th or 5th car in line here, you're waiting, you know, 15, 20 minutes to fuel. That's not acceptable from our point of view. We did identify this issue early on, and we've worked to develop higher capacity fueling stations. Of course, that investment in that development takes some time, so we're finally seeing the benefit of those stations hitting the road last year and this year. But multiple fueling positions are now possible, and we're also seeing that there's a significant reduction in cost to the consumer. So we've already, at our higher capacity fueling stations, aggressively began to reduce the cost at the pump. So just to give you an idea, that small footprint that you see there on the left, it's 2 hydrogen dispensers, 4 fueling positions, that can do about 300 cars in a day. So think about that real estate and what you're achieving in terms of zero emission fueling with that small footprint. It just shows the potential for hydrogen to achieve scale. Next slide, please. And I know I'm a little over time here, so I'll try to go quickly. The second learning that I wanted to share is the hydrogen fuel supply chain needs to be dedicated and more robust. So I don't think it's any secret to anybody that one of our early challenges and stumbling blocks has been the availability and consistency of hydrogen supply. I think we relied on kind of traditional industries and byproduct hydrogen to serve our stations. Again, this was an issue that First Element identified early on, but it's taken time for the investments to materialize into infrastructure assets. Excitingly, one of the things that we did is we worked with Air Liquide to come up with a strategy for a dedicated renewable supply. Air Liquide has invested $150 million to build this new liquid hydrogen production facility that is dedicated to the mobility sector. There's just some photos here of the earthwork that's being done. I think that photo was actually taken a few months ago, so it's a little further along now. And the plans for what the plant will look like. And excitingly, this is also a 100% renewable hydrogen facility. Next slide, please. That's a good transition, I think, for learning number 3, which is that the policies in California are achieving aggressive renewable content and carbon reduction in the hydrogen for the transportation sector. So what I show here is some comparisons with electricity, and I do that for 2 reasons. One, although hydrogen in its use is like a molecule, right? We can store it, we can refuel quickly with it, it's energy dense. In terms of how it's produced, it's actually more akin to electricity, right? There are multiple sources and ways to produce hydrogen. It has the advantage of being able to be produced locally. It can be done in cleaner or less clean ways, depending on how policy structures and incentives are set up. I also wanted to use this because we look at California as a model for success in terms of renewable penetration for electricity. And you can see how compared to the rest of the United States, California has a 30% renewable content, much higher than the rest of the US electricity grid. But excitingly, the policies in California have incentivized us to, number one, we are required to meet a 33% renewable hydrogen standard. So already higher than the 30% electricity in California. We are heavily incentivized by the LCFS program to hit a 40% renewable hydrogen content. And actually, it makes it, the way the policy is structured, it makes it feasible to even go to a much higher renewable hydrogen content. So today, our hydrogen feedstock is actually 100% renewable for all the hydrogen that First Element is distributing. You can see in our graph here that we do have some percentage of fossil fuels, and that's actually comes from two things. One is the transport of hydrogen. So we do have a small amount of petroleum, which accounts for moving hydrogen around and delivering it to our stations. And then the rest of that accounts for processes where we have to depend on electricity, like compression and refrigeration. So we do have some fossil fuels in our well-to-wheels supply from some of the process energy that we use. So I think I want to stress that there is a real opportunity here, with the policy mechanism done correctly, to keep the renewable content very high. I also want to just take one extra moment before I conclude to say that with the production and distribution system that First Element is implementing, I would be really excited to look at the potential for using remote wind energy, like offshore wind in California, and being able to move that into the urban areas. So I would be very interested to work with the Energy Commission on looking at that potential. So I'll conclude with that and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Shane. And now we'll move on to our last panelist, who is Dave Edwards. He is a director and advocate for hydrogen energy for Air Liquide in the United States. Dave is responsible for establishing and maintaining internal and external partnerships with industry, academia, and government entities to advance the technology and business opportunities in hydrogen energy. Dave has been with Air Liquide for more than 20 years in a wide range of energy-related roles. And I also want to mention that Air Liquide has developed and operates 3 hydrogen refueling stations in California. So today, Dave is going to speak not only about Air Liquide, but also about the Hydrogen Council, of which Air Liquide is a founder and co-chair. Launched during the 2017 World Economic Forum, the Hydrogen Council is a global initiative of more than 80 leading energy, transport, and industry companies with a united vision and long-term ambition for hydrogen to foster the energy transition. And I just wanted to say a few more words about Dave. Even though he resides on the East Coast, he has become a fixture at our CEC workshops and Air Resources Board workshops, and really any meeting in California related to hydrogen. He's become an expert in many of our programs and policies, and I've really appreciated the insight and the meaningful feedback he has provided in our staff workshops that have helped us understand issues related to hydrogen supply, and which have enabled us to improve how we structure our funding opportunities. So thanks for joining us, Dave, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Just to confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So one of the advantages of going last is that most of my messages have already been presented by somebody. I think that Dr. Wang did a great job of giving the overall economic picture from a global perspective. I'm going to look a little bit more on the U.S. side. And then, my colleagues from Shell and from First Element really, hit the ground running with where things stand today and where they can go. So if we go to my first slide, the first thing I'm going to do is give people a homework assignment, and that is that there's some additional information out there. The Bloomberg report is a fantastic reference. This is another reference, one that was put together about 6 months ago by U.S. industrial partners. most of us being members of the Hydrogen Council, but to give a US specific roadmap. This is very much around the economics of the roadmap. I am not going to go through the details of this. I think the most telling takeaway from the entire report is actually the inside front cover that lists the companies that participated in developing the information in the report. I think that just a few years ago, had we put this roadmap together, the participants would have been the hydrogen producers, a subset of the auto manufacturers, and maybe one or two energy companies. But what we saw last year when we wanted to put this roadmap together was there was huge interest from a much more diverse cross-section of industries. So you start to see players like Exelon and Southern Company who are concerned about the grid. You start to see SoCal Gas participating because they're interested in natural gas. And you see a lot of the bigger energy companies starting to participate. So when people think about the industries impacted by hydrogen, it now is a much broader spectrum of participants. If we go to the next slide. This is a cartoon picture of where hydrogen fits into the energy structures that we've been talking about. We've talked a lot about the use of the electric grid to produce hydrogen from electrolysis, going from red to blue at the top. We've talked about natural gas and other fossil-based feedstocks going through reforming and gasification processes into hydrogen at the bottom. We've also talked about how renewables, wind and solar, and also renewable natural gas can feed into both of those networks and produce renewable hydrogen along these pathways. The important thing about hydrogen, and I think Wayne hit this point earlier, is its flexibility in how it is produced and how it is used. We tend to focus on the application space, and I think for the context of today, we tend to focus around transportation fuel. So we look at that little circle on the top right and we say, this is the area where we are going to implement hydrogen, and this is what we're going to focus on. But we tend to lose the bigger picture, and that is that hydrogen is then interconnected to these other sectors. And as hydrogen grows as an energy vector, we enable a lot of these other options to happen. And one thing that's really important, and I think the question that maybe Commissioner Monahan opened the session with, and that is how do we cede leadership to other regions of the globe? One thing to keep in mind is that the hydrogen solution is very regional. The way we solve problems with hydrogen in California versus the way we might solve them in Texas versus the way we might solve them in the Northeast United States, let alone Europe or China, can be very different because those feedstocks might be very different, those application spaces might be very different, and the needs to solve specific problems along those different pathways can be very different. If you go to the next slide. So this is my last slide, and this is simply to answer the question that we get very often, and that is, but is it real? We only see 8,000 cars in California. We see limited penetration, but yet you talk about all of this potential for hydrogen. From an industry perspective, and now I'm speaking on behalf of Air Liquide specifically, we back that up with our investments. So Shane already pointed out the slab of earth where we're putting our new liquefier and hydrogen production facility, $150 million investment expected to come online the year after next, for example, enough to fuel 40,000 fuel cell electric vehicles in the West Coast markets. And what's really critical for us is that while this on the outside may look like our traditional method of doing industrial production of hydrogen, it's not. It's dedicated specifically to these mobility markets. So the investments that we're making, the contracts that we're signing, the supply chains that we're aligning are all aimed toward this new mobility market. And that is a huge change for how the business is managed and what the outcomes will be. The second investment you may be a little less familiar with because it's not California, is that we've also got a project in Quebec, and that's for a 20 megawatt electrolyzer unit using hydropower from Hydro-Quebec, and that's to provide renewable hydrogen into our Northeast markets. We already have a liquefier there. This electrolyzer unit will then provide about 8 to 10 tons per day of renewable liquid hydrogen into our Northeast markets, which is our next area of penetration. We have a number of stations, a number of opportunities in the northeastern parts of the United States as well. I'm going to end it with that because I know that the discussion is probably the most important part of the day today. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Thanks, Dave. So now I'm going to turn it over to our virtual dais and to Commissioner Monahan for any questions and comments.
Well, thank you. This was really fascinating. And I encourage Commissioner Douglas to join and Retta, if she is still on, to join as well. I do have a number of questions. and I'm sorry my dog is barking in the background. I keep coming back to this international, how does California stimulate international investment in hydrogen and fuel cells? And how do we make sure that we're creating a global ecosystem that is investing in these zero emission technologies and fuels? And I'm wondering, this might be a question for Jacob. With the target setting that the countries are making on hydrogen and specifically on fuel cells, do you have a sense of which countries are sort of furthest along? I mean, one would guess Japan and Korea are the two leads. But I'm just curious, from your perspective, who would you put in that leadership role together with California?
I mean, I think some of the policy support mechanisms that California has already put in place have been inspirational to a wide range of regions and countries beyond California. And from my perspective, those kind of more technology neutral mechanisms like the LCFS, when supported by other more technology forcing, I mean, a portfolio of policies like the LCFS plus the ZEV mandates are things that have not only been adopted by other states, but also, considered increasingly by China, adopted by various provinces in Canada, and I think have been always a point of discussion here at the International Energy Agency and a source of inspiration. I think that those kind of mechanisms are flexible to kind of the uncertainties in technology development that I think are somewhat inevitable, and really help businesses that have a clearer picture of their particular technology and the potential applications that go along with that technology to stimulate the investments that can then translate into niches, market niches that make sense. And I think, climate policy will necessarily need to be a part. We saw the marginal cost of abatement curves that were shown by Xiaoting, and I think that lots of the places where I see a clear need for hydrogen and for green production of hydrogen, coupling with variable renewables and electrolysis, lots of those clearest applications where I don't see any other potential technology to substitute, things like either hydrogen fuel cells eventually, or initially ICE combustion in ships, eventually fuel cells, perhaps ammonia fuel cells in ships, synthetic fuels.
Jacob, I think my question is different though. I'm not questioning the need for a diverse set of zero emission fuels and technologies. I'm asking which countries are going to be our allies in accelerating deployment of zero emission fuel cell vehicles. And yeah, I say that because, I look at Japan and I think Japan should be our ally. Japan should be doing this, and they are, but they have 3 times the vehicle population of California and 1/3 the number of fuel cell vehicles, or at least they did when I last checked. And we need Japan as a big partner in this. Toyota is arguably the #1 manufacturer invested in fuel cells. So we have to build this global ecosystem, and that is something I actually went to China right before the coronavirus, as the coronavirus was hitting, to try to develop a partnership with Zhangjiakou, their lead city on renewable hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles. And you showed a chart where China had targets and deployment of fuel cell vehicles, arguably because their buses are using a lot more energy than our light duty vehicles are. They may be, I'm not sure, you tell me, the #1 hydrogen use for vehicles in the world because of the number of buses that they're fueling. So China seems to me like a clear potential partner. They really drove down the price of battery electric vehicles. Could they do the same on fuel cell electric vehicles is, I think, a question that weighs on my mind. And I'm just curious, what other countries should we look to partner? Who are the countries that we really need to activate in addition to China and Japan to be partners with us here in California to build the fuel cell market? Looks like Wayne has a response. So
I think
Wayne is raising his hand over there.
I mentioned also Germany and France. And indeed, Air Liquide just built or just announced that they're going to start building a station here in France, probably using nuclear, but it's a bit unclear, with electrolysis for trucks, for long-haul trucks, to fuel long-haul trucks, which I think is a discussion point. But I'll let Wayne also give his opinion on the question.
Commissioner, thanks. It's a good question. And I think from the industry side of things, we certainly are already doing that. I suppose Dave at Air Liquide as well. We're developing hydrogen in core markets around the world. Those core markets are because they are good places to get started. And as we do that, we create the transferable benefits. So some of what we accomplish in California can transfer to other markets. Some of what we're doing in Germany and China can transfer back over here. I would observe then, if your question is about policy partners and kind of moving forward on that front, there are other countries that are now going bigger than California, bigger in scale and scope. And I would say those are Japan, Korea, China, Germany, and the EU. They're moving forward with larger steps and with kind of the coupling of sectors, broader scope. I see other places following the very good structures that California has put in place. It's largely Canada, the ZEV states, but the structures of low carbon fuel standard and other things that California has pioneered are now, from a policy perspective, transferring to markets where we can then go invest. The last thing I'd say is I think there are aspects that are transferable. A lot of the progress in equipment and products, cost and performance efficiencies are transferable across markets as long as we do our job on standardizing the codes and et cetera. Some things are market specific, and Dave talked about this. The infrastructure is specific to the market. Develops in California somewhat differently than other places, and needs to develop kind of at pace. Thank you.
Yeah, Dave.
And this is Dave. So I think I would break it down into a couple different categories. There is the development required for new technologies and new solutions that come out of things like the national labs and at the fundamental research levels. And I think that's going to continue to be a global phenomenon. We see that almost everywhere in all the countries that we mentioned so far, that there is technology development occurring. The thing that's really interesting from the industry perspective is where are the projects then being deployed? And we find that that tends to be very regionally specific. We find that Denmark is very much focused on offshore wind to electrolysis to hydrogen for fuel. We find that Japan is very much structured around the societal integration of hydrogen into hydrogen communities, including resiliency and power. And they're also looking with Australia to do this large scale, long distance transport. China very focused on large vehicles, especially around buses. And the U.S. focused around, a number of different things in different regions. In California, it's very much around transportation. In the Northeast United States, the discussion is much more around grid resiliency, the outcomes from Superstorm Sandy, and how do you address that with hydrogen in your ecosystem. And then a place like Texas, which has all this vested infrastructure in fossil, how do they make a conversion to a renewable future? And is there a role for hydrogen to allow them to make that transition? Even within the US, very, very different regional structures. But California can learn from all of those big projects that are happening other places. And of course, everybody's learning from California as we do the big projects here as well.
Great, thank you. Retta or Commissioner Douglas, do you have questions? All right, Jane, why don't we turn it over to you for facilitating the discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thank you. So I thought maybe we would pick up with where I think sort of where Dave just left off with about how in California we've been largely focused on hydrogen for transportation, but that in other places like in the Northeast, more for grid resiliency. We do know we have the duck curve issue in California. Do you see, what are the opportunities you see for California to focus more on the grid resiliency issue And maybe I'll start with you, Dave, since you were started talking about it, and then we'll go to anyone else.
Excellent. So grid resiliency and hydrogen storage means two things. It means you need to have electrolysis at scale, and you have to have that integrated with either wind or solar in a way that makes sense. I think Dr. Wang did a good job of outlining, why wind might be better, because you get higher utilization and therefore better capital utilization and costs are better, for example, but it's not exclusive to wind, for example. The second thing that you need is large-scale storage and or an outlet for that hydrogen. And the outlet could be any of those application spaces we talked about. In California, the obvious outlet is transportation fuels today, but it could be any of those other industrial sectors, for example, in the future. But storage becomes an issue. And storage in hydrogen generally means a couple of things. It means things like pipelines. There aren't a lot of pipelines in California today. Are we envisioning a future where we have a hydrogen pipeline system that enables large-scale storage? We're probably some decades away from that level of infrastructure, but it's the kind of things we should be planning toward. And the other kind of storage are the ones that came up earlier in things like geologic storage. So can you have caverns? Can you have EOR applications or other places where hydrogen storage can potentially both from a storage of hydrogen perspective, but also the storage from the CO2 perspective, I think for the CO2 capture side of hydrogen production, for example, become intertwined. And I think those are aspects that need to be addressed in order to think about large-scale solar. All things that have been demonstrated other places in the world, the pieces need to be put together and the economics need to make sense to do it.
Wayne.
If it's okay, Jan, just add at a general level, the future hydrogen society and energy system is, I think, fairly evident and has been analyzed a lot. Oftentimes the question is, what's the next step? How do we start moving in that direction? My reflection is that the archetypes for electrolysis in California are starting to become evident. So that's one conversation. Is that what policy would like to have built, because it's starting to become evident. The other is, we sure are glad that we got started on renewable power generation with a renewable portfolio standard and then an investment tax credit. So in some ways, don't worry about getting it exactly right. Get started. We sure will be glad a decade from now that we got started with some blending of hydrogen into natural gas and some investment tax credit to start scaling up hydrogen as well.
Great. I thought maybe I'd turn to Shane now. You talked about a lot of the private investment that you've attracted to First Element Fuel, but I was wondering what the state can do to attract more private investment to hydrogen station development and operation from your perspective.
It's a great question. I think one quick answer is keep doing what you're doing, right? Consistent policy signals are really important. I think we have a framework in California of policy that's working, and the private companies are seeing that, right? And they're seeing it as a good ecosystem for investment. I think one thing that goes actually back to Commissioner Monahan's question too is that, it's right now, if you look at globally, different places have their strengths, right? I would say in California, we're probably further along on the real retail hydrogen experience, right? Having stations open 24/7 with a simple credit card swipe. The ZEV policy drives a lot of activity at those stations because we do have, a good initial deployment of fuel cell cars here. The EU, for example, is doing, I think, energy storage through electrolysis more aggressively than we are here, right? So we have that to learn from them. So I think if we are in a leadership position on that thing or on other things, it will unlock more private investment. The most recent capital raise that we completed was from two Japanese institutions. One is Mitsui and the other one is the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. What's exciting about that is these are both financial institutions, right? So you're seeing, rather than strategic players, you're seeing financial institutions now coming in and investing in hydrogen. The other thing that's exciting about that is it's a foreign player putting money here because they want to see the market continue to grow and continue to get learnings from the things that we are doing well here, right? So, so I would say, you know, on the one hand, yes, we want, you know, other partners in the world to be shouldering the burden. On the other hand, there are big benefits to being in a leadership position because you're going to see that international investment in those international dollars coming to California and being put to work here to create jobs, to create an infrastructure, to create an industry. So I think, you know, where there are those other areas that hydrogen infrastructure is expanding, look for policies that can be implemented that are more market-based, that encourage the private investment, and then, you know, be consistent in terms of the commitment.
Great, thanks. So I think I wanted to try to ask a sort of bigger question that I think you probably all have thoughts on. And that is, so I think I can safely say you all see hydrogen as being essential to to decarbonizing the transportation sector and meeting our overall climate change goals. But I think, you know, there's, like we've talked about already, there's a lot of different ways to think about the role hydrogen, like what's the best role that hydrogen can play? How can it best serve this role? And if we focus just in transportation, that's such a heterogeneous sector. And I think, like, for instance, Wayne, you talked a little bit about thinking about kind of the use rather than the duty of the vehicle, but I thought maybe you could expand more on that, how you all think, you know, kind of ideally, where should hydrogen be used most efficiently in the transportation sector? And then on top of that, how do we plan our infrastructure for that most effectively?
Wow, that's a big question. Maybe I can.
And then everything's solved then.
Well, if we solve that question, then everything is clear. So let's do it. Maybe I take the first bit and leave and then how do we develop toward that as a second topic. The first bit, from our perspective, we are a fuel retailer. We think about serving the customer with the best kind of product we can. So the value proposition is strong. I think it's important that we translate from what is often a use case that's articulated in a vehicle class into a customer segment. So when we talk, and we heard it earlier today, when the natural place for hydrogen is understood as heavy duty. Well, really what I think we're saying is a high output, high utilization vehicle, a place where fast refueling is important. So the strongest demand for fuel cell vehicles at present is in fact in forklift, material handling, where it's inside a warehouse, so it needs to be zero emission. And the uptime of that asset is so important for that fleet, that business operation. And the total cost of ownership then becomes clear, and hydrogen forklifts are expanding greatly. So then indeed, it was said earlier, we can think about the kinds of places in on-road transport where that high output, high utilization exists, and it might be in taxi cabs and shared mobility in a light duty vehicle, and it might be in Class 8 trucks hauling beer from one point to another. So again, it might exist all the way across those vehicle classes. The last thing to realize, I think, is that there is a customer preference involved as well. There are large and growing customer segments who want that capability. SUVs and pickup trucks are growing segments. A person who's commuting in a pickup truck may not be using that capability, but they wanted to purchase it. So as we develop charging and we develop hydrogen, we think about market segments. We think about customers who want a particular level of service. We find that there are people for whom charging works very well, and in fact is an improvement to be able to charge instead of refuel. And we find segments for whom charging will not work very well, and in fact it's a significant difficulty and negative in their utility function, and they would love to refuel. So I think that's our perspective, thinking that hydrogen and charging are complementary from a customer and value perspective. Of course, there are complementary aspects on board the vehicle. We don't have OEMs with us right now, but you know, the kind of shared components in an electric drivetrain, et cetera. So we see these as very much complementary, and therefore develop hydrogen for those customer segments for whom it will perform very well.
And did anyone else want to add to that, or? I think not. I will move on then. I did want to, let's see. I think next I wanted to go to Shane to talk a bit about what we've already talked about a bit so far, is that it's hard to match where the hydrogen is produced with where it's needed for various purposes, but including getting it to the refueling stations. And, you know, we've known actually that in California, we have had some issues with getting supply to stations, and that some stations have been out of fuel at times. So I know at First Element, you've made a big transition to liquid hydrogen as, I think, a solution, at least one element, one reason is it's a solution to help with that issue. But maybe talk about that, and also where you think what else needs to be done in the liquid hydrogen space to enable its use in transportation.
Yeah, happy to do so. So the transition to liquid hydrogen, I think we saw you know, multiple benefits to it. One, as you say, is to be able to a little more successfully and economically transport hydrogen from what might be a somewhat stranded you know, region and get it into urban areas. Another one is scale, right? You can move around and store liquid hydrogen at much higher densities. You know, today we're doing hydrogen stations with 4 fueling positions, and we're seeing a business case take shape, right? Well, 4 fueling positions is tiny for a gasoline station, right? I mean, you almost never see a gas station that small. So, you know, once we're able to scale to, you know, doing the kind of volume that a gasoline station does, and, you know, we can do that with liquid hydrogen, the economic outlook and the business case and the ability to get price competition with gasoline is even better, right? So it just looks better over time as we go to bigger volumes. So I do want to stress though that, you know, it's I guess a blessing and a curse, right? I mean, on the one hand, yeah, you don't want to move hydrogen huge distances. It can be done. You know, there are examples globally of people looking at shipping liquid hydrogen, you know, across the Pacific Ocean. But you know, we should be, I think, taking advantage of one of the benefits of hydrogen, which is that you can develop more local and regional resources to produce your hydrogen, right? So in California, one of the big things that we have is a lot of ag waste and food waste, right, for example. And I would say, maybe this is arguable, but I would say that using hydrogen in transportation is probably the most effective way to put that ag waste and food waste into work for energy, right, and to reduce carbon. So that's absolutely an opportunity that we should be looking at and taking. But, you know, as I mentioned, Commissioner Douglas brought up in Northern California, you know, potentially offshore wind. With liquid hydrogen production and distribution, I think that's something that we could tap into and actually utilize and do that economically and make it work. So, so that shift, I think, was, you know, for several reasons, but it does unlock that possibility, I think, to tap into resources that might be a little bit more remote, a little bit more stranded, and get them into Southern California. I know, you know, it's not the only model that people are using to scale, you know, so there's still different approaches being taken, but this is the direction that First Element is going in. So.
I think I saw that Wayne wanted to add something.
Thanks. If I could just build on Shane's good comments by saying this is an area of important collaboration between policy and industry, the importance of a roadmap, of an idea of where we are headed, because your second question, Jane, was, and so how do we build the right infrastructure? And that depends on where we're headed. So gaseous and liquid, trucks and pipes, it all kind of depends, as we heard from the earlier speakers today, on in what direction are we headed. And we in industry can certainly make our assessments and investments as best we can. sharing that viewpoint with you and hearing your viewpoint on the policy objectives helps us to navigate in the right direction.
Dave.
And I'd just like to add to that, as I pointed out earlier, and as Wayne has said, flexibility of supply is really important, especially in these early stages where there's not a silver bullet that's going to solve every problem for every location at every site or every station, even within the state of California, for example. We are going to see gaseous delivery, liquid deliveries, and in the relatively near future, we might to see some of these other carriers involved in hydrogen movement within California as well. That is inevitably part of our future of how we think about this energy structure, is the flexibility of how you move it, and therefore how and when you make those investments regionally and with the technology base that you've got.
Great. So we could continue on forever, or at least I could, but I have been told it's our time to move on to questions. Actually, well, let me turn it over to Jacob real quick. I understand you want to ask a question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience Q&A.
Great. Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that California has been really successful in building out this broad network of stations, and indeed anyone owning a Prius anyone owning a Mirai can go, anywhere across the state. But I wonder, what would be your plan for trying to build out hydrogen stations beyond California? And what do you see as the challenges in doing so?
Wayne, you first or me?
Go ahead, Shane. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think what First Element set out to do from the very start was to develop a model that is three things: scalable, right? Can create a good business case, and can be exportable to other regions, right? So I think we're there. I think there have to be a little bit of a perfect storm of policy incentives to encourage the expansion into other states. I don't think we're that far away from seeing that happen. And so, I think our model is expandable. I think we like, again, the policy mechanisms California to have some CapEx funding from the Energy Commission on one hand, and then to have something like the LCFS capacity credit program. Not every state has an LCFS program, so that may not be possible, but something like that that's more of a market-based mechanism to encourage, the private investment through a successful long-term operation of a station. I think those two are very good elements that would spur a lot of development. The last thing that I'll say is, again, if we can show and are showing and continue to show success on the light duty side, I think you will see more and more interest snowball on the heavy duty and transit sectors. There may be an opportunity to leverage some of that infrastructure to help expand, the retail stations to other states as well. I hesitate a little bit there because I think it's the exception rather than the norm for a retail hydrogen station to be coupled with a heavy duty hydrogen station, right? I don't think that's viable in most considerations. But if you're looking at more of a connecting network of stations to take you across the region, there may be some opportunities to leverage like a heavy duty station to put retail infrastructure there. So I think I'll conclude with that, and Wayne can fill in any gaps that I missed.
Well, it's again a good question and a big area. A few additional thoughts. Fundamentally, hydrogen mobility is demand constrained by the number of fuel cell stacks being produced and vehicles coming to market. So what that means is coordination, infrastructure being developed where the vehicles are going. So far, that's primarily where the vehicles are pulled by policy, a zero emission vehicle mandate of some kind, like in California, or equivalent kinds of policies in Asia and Europe. The second thing is that, as Shane alluded to earlier, I think we've learned our lesson in that you develop for the success case. Why would you build infrastructure for the failure case? Don't even get started. So in building for the success case, a refueling station that fuels vehicles back to back like gasoline and performs, it necessarily has a low initial utilization. That's true whether it's light duty vehicles or commercial fleets. We need to understand that simply a commercial fleet does not solve that problem. And so it means that there's a bridge. And as Shane said, the HRI pathway and the low carbon fuel standard in California is one of those example pathways. It was called policy magic recently at an ARB hearing because it pulls on two levers at the same time. One is how to get that infrastructure capacity built a little bit ahead of the vehicles. In the chicken and egg question, I think that's been answered, that the infrastructure needs to come a bit ahead of the vehicles. And the second is to decarbonize the supply. The low carbon fuel standard is not so effective just in its base form for hydrogen because we sell so little hydrogen from the beginning. So as was alluded to today, that pathway in California has sent a very strong signal that everyone has responded to decarbonize hydrogen from the start. So policy magic.
Let me.
So I think. Shane, yes.
I just quickly want to build on one point that Wayne made about the LCFS program encouraging decarbonization of the hydrogen pathways. I think it's so important to note how successful that program is, and also at doing it based on the achievable metric, right? Ultimately, what we're trying to do is reduce carbon. And I think I'm going to speak a little bit bluntly here, right? In the legislature, you get things that are politically more favorable, right? You get the political flavor of the week. And sometimes that means, the renewable energy flavor of the week, right? Like somebody decides that one renewable energy is better than another one because, I don't know, they're being lobbied or whatever. So I think it's the job of the agencies, and I think the agencies, both CEC and ARB, have done a great job of this. It's the job of the agencies to take a more level-headed approach and say, no, we need to look at renewables not based on flavor of the week, but rather on the desired outcome, right? Which ultimately is reduced carbon, reduced criteria pollutant emissions. So the LCFS, I think, is one great mechanism to do that. CEC has several mechanisms to do that well, and I would just encourage to keep taking that even-minded approach. So hopefully I said that well without offending any legislators. But
All right, well, on that note, we will turn it over to questions for participants. So Jonathan, I think you're going to pose some for us.
Do we want to go to hands? I know we have several hands up.
Jonathan, if you had a couple of
Q&A,
this is Heather.
From Q&A.
Yeah, we'll do the hands up for the public comment period. Thanks.
All right, and this question isn't directed towards anyone in particular, but from Glenn Rambach. In what way is California engaging the electrical utilities and Cal ISO in the approach to hydrogen as an electricity storage and transport medium?
I don't know if any of us is the best person to answer that question. I know there's certainly been a lot of interagency discussion. Did you have your hand raised, Wayne, or were you just moving your hand?
I just wanted to say what a great question, and I imagine it's not easy. Amongst the agencies, you all are very busy and operating within your scope. To do harmonization across agencies, I imagine is difficult. I just echo the person's question. It's an important area to work on.
Great. And one question that got touched on, but didn't, it might have been more upstream, was about supply disruptions. And let me see. It's like, how do we ensure that there's no support, or what is the resiliency of hydrogen on the supply side?
Go ahead, Wayne.
It's Wayne. I have a thought on that one very briefly, which is we finished the launch. I mean, what we observe right now is we're at a delicate place where the adoption is starting to happen, but the supply chain is very thin. It's very difficult to have reliability and resiliency in a thin system of any kind. So it's imperative for all of us to succeed that we move on past this nascent phase into a more system with more depth. So let's finish the launch here.
Yeah, you want to add to that, Dave?
Yeah, I would add, amplify exactly what Wayne said, and that is in the early days of an energy transition, we're faced both with economic, technical, and operational challenges in making this transition. And the events of last summer that caused some of the interruptions are really indicative of those early stage developments. But with a stable market that's growing with investments, and the investments, some of the ones that we announced from Air Liquide, but a lot of the ones from other companies as well, are directly going to address that. Robustness comes with size, but it also comes with planning and investments specific into this market. Keep in mind that most of the hydrogen that goes into a fuel cell vehicle today is relying on infrastructure that was put in place for other applications. It was put in place for industrial supply or for refinery applications. And we're peeling some of that off and generating renewables and putting it into this new market, but still relying on that infrastructure that wasn't optimized for it. Going forward, all the investments that we're making now are specific to this mobility market, meaning, the resiliency, the reliability, the redundancy are now meeting the targets of individual consumers driving cars, very different than an industrial supply managing a contract, for example.
And if I could weigh in a little bit too, one of the slides I think was titled that the supply of hydrogen has to be dedicated and more robust, right? So I think Wayne and Dave already hit on some of those points. We're relying on byproduct hydrogen, and a supply chain that was not necessarily robust enough. First Element, I think we realized this, back in 2015, right around the time we were opening our very first stations, right? We saw weaknesses in the supply chain. We saw that demand was going to be bigger, but I think there were two challenges, right? One is that it took a while to convince people of that because everybody thought, oh, this First Element, that's just those idealistic, optimistic guys, And I think the second challenge is that, when you recognize the issue and start making investments in infrastructure, it takes time for infrastructure, right? It's not developing a new app, right, or a new smartphone. Infrastructure developments just take more time to materialize. So I think, as Dave said, some of those announcements have been made and are public. I can assure you that there are a lot of other investments being made. So, I think we feel much more comfortable with the outlook than what we knew in the past. Unfortunately, I can't talk very specifically about a lot of the stuff that's happening because it's competitive information. It's stuff that has not been publicly announced. But I think the challenges of the past were well kind of articulated here, and I think we've recognized what the future needs. It's some redundancy and robustness, but also just dedicated supply for this marketplace, and those things are happening, and investments are being made, and the outlook is much better.
Great. So I think we have reached the time limit on our panel. I want to thank all of our panelists. It's been a great discussion. And Heather, I think you might want to introduce the public comment period.
Right. Thank you, Jane. This is Heather Raitt. Thank you, Jane, and thank you so much to our panelists. Super helpful discussion. So we do need to move on to the public comment period. And Rosemary of Avalos is from our Public Advisor Office here to help us with that. And I'll just remind folks to go ahead and use the raise hand function if you'd like to make a comment. And for folks on the phone, press *9 to raise your hand to let us know you'd like to make a comment. And Rosemary, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Heather. And yes, I'm Rosemary Avalos with the Public Advisor's Office. And I'll first call on attendees using the raised hand feature on Zoom. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. Also, spell your first and last name after you are unmuted and before commenting. And do not use the speakerphone feature when talking because we won't be able to hear you clearly. Okay, I'm going to call on Bernard Barriere. Go ahead, and you'll need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm Bernard Barriere, aka Barney, and I'm with the Biomass Biochar Cooperative, and also helping out New Fuels, a biomass to hydrogen conversion technology using gasification and Fischer-Tropsch. My question is, what role do you see? Obviously, my interests intersect in the reduction of the overburden of biomass, both in the forest and in the fields, and the production of hydrogen fuel cell. And by the way, my name was stolen. I had a company called First Element Power Systems, a hydrogen fuel cell integration company in 2000. But so it's a great name, and I'm glad that it's being used today for fueling stations. Thank you for your receiving my question.
Bernard, this is the court reporter. Could you please spell your name, sir? Thank you.
Yes, B-E-R-N-A-R-D B-E-R-R-I-E-R.
Okay, we will move on to the next public comment. Ray Pingle, go ahead, and your line is open.
Good morning. This is Ray Pingle from Sierra Club, California, and this is really just an excellent workshop. You know, clearly one of the most important objectives we have in doing all of this is to use carbon-free fuel. And I would like to make a recommendation to the Energy Commission. It's got some excellent reports on its website on tracking progress. And there's a tracking progress report for zero emission vehicles. And it does have a section where it talks about hydrogen fueling stations, but it makes little mention about the renewable content of the hydrogen fuel. And so I would like to recommend that going forward, the CEC specifically maybe have a graph or something that documents what is the percentage renewable content of all the hydrogen fuel utilized in the state by year, and with the goal obviously to increasing it to 100%. I know right now there's a law requiring 33%, that exceeds that, but I think that would be very helpful for us to track that. Having said that, I would just like to ask the question to anybody that has a sense of what percentage of renewable fuel might we have by, say, 2030. I'm encouraged by the partnership between Eloquid and First Element to build a large 100% renewable hydrogen plant in Nevada. But is that a trend within the industry? So I appreciate any comments on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pringle. This is Rosemary with the Public Advisor's Office, and I just want to remind those that are going to provide public comment that this is solely for public comment. You can ask questions, but it's not, you will not be receiving a response. You can ask your questions within the docket system, and staff will review, but during this period it's for public comment solely. And also I want to remind you to spell your first and last name and your affiliation. Okay, we'll take on the next public comment. Kate, go ahead. You'll need to unmute yourself, Kate. Okay, we'll go on to David Uselton. We'll go ahead and unmute Dave. I think we're having a problem with Kate. Go ahead, Dave.
Hi, thank you. My name is David Usselton. I'll spell that last name for you, U-S-E-L-T-O-N. I have no affiliation other than being a fuel cell driver for now our third generation. We started with the Tucson from Hyundai, third one to come in the US, went to a Mirai, now in a Nexo. A couple of quick things. One, I'm hoping that maybe we can rethink the way we subsidize the fuel. Over the past 7 years, my wife and I have seen so many people who seem to be in it for the free fuel. And we're not. We're in it because we believe it's the right future for our children. I'd like to thank all of the participants here that are in it for that reason, which I believe most of you are, right? That this is a long-term game to help our global ecosystem and our children have a better future. And so maybe there's some ways to rethink the free fuel. Maybe it's a subsidy to standard cost of fossil fuels. Maybe it's something else. I get it. Some people say it's a way to offset the cost of the vehicle. But there must be other ways to do that, including maybe lifting the restriction on 3 vehicles in a row, getting some subsidy on the cost of the vehicle, and then pay for more of the fuel, just to get people in it for the right reasons, right? Otherwise, they just get mad. When they can't fuel, they get mad. They post all over Facebook. They give it a bad reputation when all they were looking for was free fuel. And we got into this when my son saw it. And we bought him a model from Hammer and Slimmer, and he put it together and said, "Why isn't every car like this, Dad?" I said, "Well, do the math on the cost." He did. In fact, he got quite a good grade from his teacher for having done the math. And at the time, it wasn't viable. And we had the discussion that someday it will be. And this is the right answer. So I urge everybody to take a long, hard look at, are there other ways to be subsidizing the adoption that doesn't just necessarily give people free fuel? Maybe it's open corridors to more places for, I hate to say it, but people that have a little more wealth that do invest in this because they believe in the green, but we don't quite have the transportation corridors to get there, like to Palm Springs and so forth. But again, that puts it on high wealth people, and that's probably not our objective with tax dollars. But maybe some way to just rethink that. Well, I have 1 minute left. I would just also like to thank True Zero and Shell, both you two, build fantastic stations, right? And the fact that we're now going to see more adoption to infrastructure by people, we thank you for that commitment as well. I forget the name of the company that does the stuff that's building the new plant. All of you guys do great work. I hope someone will go scrutinize Iwatani. They've been an embarrassment at that San Juan station for 1.5 years now, or maybe it's just over 1 year. But I hope someone's in there looking at them real hard and saying, "Hey, if you want any more tax dollars from us, make this station work." That's it. Again, just the last point. Love it. We really support it for the long term and what it does for our families and our futures. And we thank everyone that's putting a great effort into reality.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lupin. The next public comment is from Tim Sassin. Go ahead, Mr. Sassin.
Hi, this is Tim Sassin from Ballard Power Systems. My name's spelled T-I-M, last name S-A-S-S-E-E-N. Thank you for this great workshop. Really appreciate the Energy Commission listening to the hydrogen industry and reaching out to get the most up-to-date and informative information. Excellent. Really want to thank Commissioner Monahan in particular and comment on one thing that she raised, which is the efficiency question. This is something that's brought up for hydrogen quite often. And on the hydrogen side, you know, we try to be transparent about how our losses are on fuel cells and for electrolyzers. On the battery side, it's not always as apparent. And it's not just the round trip efficiency of a battery. You have to take into account transmission losses on the order of 4%, distribution losses that can be about the same, chargers, which can be 10% for some of the 100 kilowatt-ish chargers. That can go up to 30% for some of the DC fast chargers. And then as we talk about capturing renewables for the sake of transportation, if you look at an all battery solution, storing that energy in large battery systems can also be surprisingly inefficient. I worked for a time with the Center for Sustainable Energy on the SCHIP program, and we had found, you can see it in the recent reports, that round trip efficiency for stationary battery storage is somewhere between 20 to 30% loss from HVAC systems and from self-discharge. So that's in addition to the 5% loss in charging and 5% loss in discharging. So that doesn't bring parity to fuel cells with battery efficiency, but it certainly does change the numbers and it changes the economics. So I would suggest that you look very carefully at that. And beyond that, it really is a question beyond round trip efficiency, because you have to look at how the energy carrier performs the job. For intermittent usage, for low energy density, batteries do a phenomenal job. But when you put them towards high utilization applications, as Wayne Lady was talking about. Systems get very expensive, very heavy, very cumbersome, and you have to double up or triple up resources in order to do the job. And that's where hydrogen starts to look very, very effective. So it's more than just round trip efficiency. You know, please do look deeply into those numbers and all the cost components that are required for that effort, but also look at the applicability by segment. I think all of this starts to guide California towards a more comprehensive regional, if not statewide, approach at how the energy system develops and at making big, bold moves which can get past a lot of the cost curves that so many countries now are seeing are really an effective way to get to true decarbonization through using hydrogen. Thank you again for this excellent panel. Fantastic speakers. You really did a good job in picking the right people to talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sassine. Now we go on to Deanna Haynes. And please spell your first and last name and your affiliation. And you're unmuted. Thank you. Deanna Haynes. Okay, we'll move on to William Zobel.
Can you hear me?
Oh, just one moment. Okay, we can hear you now, Deanna.
Sorry about that. Deanna Haynes, DEANNA, Haynes, HAINES with SoCal Gas. I'm just wanted to point out one of the things that Wayne had mentioned about the ability to blend hydrogen into the natural gas system. You know, the natural gas system throughout California is a very integrated, expansive network with, in Southern California, over 100,000 miles of pipe alone. And we have, you know, storage facilities that are pretty large and that could store large amounts of gas. And recently the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory released a study called Getting to Neutral that talked about the biomass conversion into hydrogen and having the system, the natural gas system, be an offtake for that hydrogen to help build that scale that some of the speakers talked about to bring those costs down. I'd like to just remind folks that that is a really good way of doing it. Plus, it's a carbon negative solution, and that can help bring the cost down overall for hydrogen, decarbonize the gas in the system, and really have synergies with, you know, creating some value out of the, you know, the fuel from agriculture and forest waste, especially with our dead trees. We have, I know, over 130 million dead trees. So that biomass and the reduction of that fuel source could also be a synergy. So there's a lot of synergies here with an integrated look at this and not just looking at it from a transportation sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Haynes. And I'm going to go ahead and make an announcement that we're going to shorten the public comment period because we have more people in the queue, and to give everyone an opportunity, we'll have to shorten the time to 1 minute. So William Zobel, go ahead. Your line is open. William, you will need to unmute yourself on your line.
Oh, there it is. Sorry about that. Yep, that popped up a little late. Good morning. My name is Bill Zobel, B-I-L-L-Z-O-B-E-L. Since I have a minute, I'll move quickly. I'm the Executive Director of the California Hydrogen Business Council. We heard a lot of speakers today. They were all very good, appreciated their comments. In particular, we heard a call for regulatory certainty to facilitate investment. Both Dr. Leahy and Dr. Stevens mentioned the business case for investment. The council recognizes this is absolutely necessary for more private capital to make its way into this market to achieve the scale necessary to unlock the full economic potential of hydrogen that was outlined by Dr. Wang in her remarks. A good example of this supportive policy being played out is being played out in the European Union, the EU, and specifically Germany, where governments and private industry have committed to spending over 9 billion euros on research and investment in hydrogen. This is a very recent and compelling example where clear and consistent policy signals support the business case and spur investment, which allow markets to grow and mature. One example close to home are the HRI credits, which have succeeded in allowing for expanded capacity, but they don't give the OEMs enough forward-looking certainty in our view. The Energy Commission can and should do more to facilitate this with positive signals coming from both new and existing programs. The AB8 funds do that. CARB recognizes the importance of extending AB8 beyond the 2023 sunset date in the recent SB 498 report. This recommendation is in line with holding to the goals of executive order, which have been given funding by the legislature. We urge the CEC to join this call for the extension of the AB8 funds. And quickly, on the production side, we also need clear and consistent policies to increase the supply and encourage producers to invest. Particularly, we need policies to accelerate decarbonized hydrogen at scale. Dr. Edwards pointed to the investment his company is making on the production side, but he also pointed to the fact that regulatory certainty is required and we need investment to meet these goals. With that, I think I'm probably close to my time, so I will conclude my remarks, and I just thank you for the opportunity to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zobel. We'll go on to David Park. Your line is unmuted. David Park.
Hi, this is David Park with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. That's DAVID-PARK. Commissioner Monahan, Commissioner Douglas, Advisor de Mesa, thank you for assembling such a holistic and knowledgeable panel today and for all these IEPR proceedings. We at the partnership are grateful for the ZEV neutral spirit of these proceedings and are hopeful that this spirit will be reflected in the policy recommendations that flow out of these hearings. To emphasize Jacob's comments, California is the world's crucible for development of environmental and energy policy, which is possibly the greatest export from our state. Whole countries follow California's lead. Our partnership, government, industry, and academia are developing a new energy economy that will pay back dividends to California for the next 3 decades. We emphasize the road to achieve the ZEV tipping point referenced by Wayne will be difficult to climb. The state and world would be wise to enable all mechanisms to lower this hurdle across ZEV platforms. To emphasize the theme of consistent policy signals and perhaps providing a look into today's afternoon sessions, we point to Governor Brown's executive order to achieve 200 fueling stations by 2025 and 5 million ZEV by 2030. I'll cut my comments short for this afternoon, but we look forward to our continued partnership. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Park. The next speaker comment is Andrew Martinez. Go ahead, Andrew. You may speak. Spell your first and last name, please.
Hi, this is Andrew Martinez, ANDREW-MARTINEZ, Staff Air Pollution Specialist with California Air Resources Board. Just want to make a couple quick comments just to clarify for members of the public, because I've heard some questions that I believe members of the public probably would benefit from being pointed towards some information resources. Obviously, thank you to everybody who's providing comments on what kind of information you'd like to see and where you'd like to see it. I'd just like to point out that both the Energy Commission and the ARB do provide semi-annual reports with updates that include a lot of the information I've heard discussed today in terms of the questions that the public is seeking. Just point members of the public to a website, arb.ca.gov/hydrogen. And I know that there are, I believe that the reports from the Energy Commission, the joint agency staff reports are on individual web pages. So perhaps that's something that the Energy Commission staff can provide later. And then just one really quick clarification. I heard that possibly there's some confusion about the fueling payment subsidies. And I just want to clarify that that is not state provided, that is provided by the auto manufacturers. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Martinez. We'll move on to Travis Andren. I'm sorry. Go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Thank you very much. That's Travis, TRAVIS-ANDREN, Andren, representing D3 Designs Inc., a social benefit corporation. My comment today is twofold. First, I'd like to understand in Dr. Wayne's presentation if there is any inclusion of nuclear and hydrogen co-production as is being researched by the U.S. Department of Energy albeit not a renewable source. It is a clean energy source that has the capacity to produce large volumes of hydrogen. Secondary, looking at vehicle-to-grid resilience, having seen a track record from power utilities such as PG&E's outages over the past 2 years, as well as other national electrical grid concerns in cooperation with increasing natural disasters from climate change. Is there an interest from the CEC and the hydrogen industry from both the vehicle application of vehicle-to-grid integration, as well as from the Energy Commission's grid integration from a distributed network of electricity producing vehicles? Thank you very much, and I appreciate the conference.
Thank you, Travis. We'll go on to Robert Perry. Your line is unmuted. Go ahead and unmute.
My name's Perry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Robert Perry. I'm an independent energy consultant. I just want to follow up on the new prior comments concerning the incredible opportunities presented by biomass, particularly in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, the 130 million dead trees. And I would direct people to look at what's being done with the Sierra Resource Conservation District. They've started a pilot project converting trees into biomass, which are now being used, the syngas is being used to run a reciprocating engine, but this is clearly a resource that can be converted to hydrogen. It eliminates an existential climate threat while converting it into a high value storage medium. So I urge everybody to seriously consider that avenue, because that is California's climate challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. We'll move on to Robert DuBois. Your line is unmuted. Okay. Mr. DuBois?
Yes.
Unmute your line. There you go.
Robert Dubois, D-U-B-O-I-S. I'm with New Fuels, and N-U-F-U-E-L-S. We have a conversion system, a non-combustion conversion system, high efficiency conversion system. I've loved listening to this on this meeting. It's I love the fact that they're working from a micro and a macro level simultaneously, and it's very, very hopeful from where we sit, and also the planet sits. My comment is, as a baby boomer, I've noticed my children and grandchildren are different culturally than we were. In other words, they view the world quite differently, and it particularly affects the private automobile. I'm not saying private automobiles are going anywhere soon, but the emphasis, I heard one commentator saying a more efficient use of hydrogen in transportation might be, in early stages, might be directed at mass transit, urban mass transit, where there'd be also an environmental effect as well, more of an environmental effect. So that's my comment, and thank you very much for letting me make it.
Thank you, Mr. Dubois. And the next commenter is Mike. Go ahead, your line is unmuted. Mike? Hello?
Hi.
There you go.
Sorry, my name is Mikhail Skavarla, not Mike. I'm here on behalf of the California Hydrogen Coalition, and that's Mikhail, M-I-K-H-A-E-L. Skavarla is S-K-V-A-R-L-A. Quickly, we appreciate the opportunity to have a hydrogen-focused workshop today. With deference to the time, I'll shorten the comments and follow up with written comments. Quickly, we encourage California to continue its leadership on hydrogen and fuel cells. We look forward to seeing how much can be achieved with the awards in the recent CAC GFO and continued support of the LCFS HRI program to build 200 light-duty fueling stations by 2025. We further look forward to working with the state to achieve 1,000 light-duty stations by 2030, which will cover 94% of California, 97% of disadvantaged communities. With regards to the questions about batteries versus fuel cells, I want to note that Mr. Sassine from Ballard did a great job at highlighting some of these issues. But further, we'll follow up in our comments with some study from Germany discussing life cycle emissions, which discuss both energy and vehicle production. And the carbon penalties that are associated with some pathways. In closing, hydrogen and fuel cells are poised to provide a great opportunity for leadership in California and helping achieve its climate goals while adding to Californians' lives. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. That concludes our public comments. I'll hand it over to Heather.
Thank you, Rosemary. Commissioners, did you have any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
No, just want to thank the panelists and all the folks that have participated remotely, asked questions, provided public comment. Really appreciate all the input.
Great. So I'll just add, this is Heather Wright, that this afternoon we have part 2 of this workshop, and it has a separate Zoom webinar ID. So please go ahead and join us and use that webinar ID that's listed here.